Today we're going to talk about the aftermath and the outcome of the June War of 1967. We're going to start off talking about what the position of the Arab states and Israel and the Americans and the Soviets and the United Nations in the aftermath of the war. Then we're going to talk about where the Palestinians are in the aftermath of that war. So to start off, for Arab states in the aftermath of this war, the Six-Day War, the June 1967 war, was a disaster for all of the Arab states, in particular Egypt. In fact, Egypt is going to find its leader in the immediate following of this war. Gamal Abdel Nasser is going to resign following this war. He resigns in disgrace. He led the nation into war, and it was an utter disaster for Egypt, and he steps down. Now, it's not going to last. He's kind of like one of these guys that's like, you know, getting into a fight, doesn't really want to get into a fight, but he makes it look like he wants to get into a fight, and he's like, hey, don't hold me back, don't hold me back. Meanwhile, he wants his friends to hold him back. Nasser resigns, and popular public support in Egypt say, no, Nasser, don't go. You're our guy. You've been our guy for the last 15 years. Don't go. And he's like, ah, shucks, okay, I'm back. So Nasser resigns for a little bit, which is just a sign that this war, of course, did not go the way Nasser wanted. Also for Egypt, the Suez Canal, which is now the border between Israeli-occupied Sinai Peninsula and Egypt proper, the Suez Canal is going to be shut down. It's shut down at the start of the war, and it will remain closed down until 1975. Why do we care about that? Why does Egypt care about that? It is a tremendous economic blow for Egypt. Remember, the Suez Canal was what Nasser originally nationalized for economic reasons to start, you know, this conflict between Egypt and Israel. Egypt almost immediately threatens retaliation against Israel. And they will find themselves pushing closer to the Soviets. They're absolutely desperate militarily now. Much of their army, and especially their tank corps, has now been destroyed in this war, and they need it to be rebuilt. They need to reestablish their military, and the Soviets can help them do that. We'll talk more about the Soviets in a few minutes. In Jordan, remember the nation of Jordan? Said the king of Jordan, King Hussein, was in a very precarious position. He knew that if he attacked Israel, it probably wouldn't end well militarily. But he also knew to not attack Israel would be hugely unpopular with his Palestinian population. So Jordan enters the war. They, of course, lose. They lose the West Bank. They lose the West Bank to Israel. And in the aftermath, King Hussein is going to push himself closer to the United States. King Hussein knows that the United States is supportive of Israel in the aftermath of the war. So if Jordan gets in good with the Americans, maybe the Americans can help Jordan get their territory back. Remember, the United States in the aftermath of this war hopes that Israel gives this land back, uses it as maybe bargaining chips for future peace projections. So maybe some deal can be worked out between Israel and Jordan where the West Bank will be unoccupied, given back to Jordan, and there can be peace between those two nations. That's where King Hussein goes in the aftermath of this war. Syria, after the war, they have another coup. And it's going to push them a little bit further away from other Arab nations, as we're going to discuss a little bit more in a few minutes. In the aftermath of the war, in August of 1967, the Arab League, the leaders of the Arab states, get together in a city called Khartoum. It's K-H-A-R-T-O-U-M. That's the capital of the Sudan. And they take part in what is known as the Khartoum Conference in August of 67. And it is here at the Khartoum Conference in the aftermath of the Six-Day War that the Arab states issue what become known as the Three No's of Khartoum. The Three No's, not no's, but N-O-S. The Three No's of Khartoum with regard to Israel. No peace with Israel, a continued state of war. no recognition of Israel, to continue to deny recognizing the existence of the state of Israel, and no negotiation with Israel. There will be no talks with the state of Israel. Because negotiating with the state of Israel essentially means you recognize the legitimacy of the state of Israel, which is not being done. So no, no, no. Yes, sir.
So was Jordan at that time?
Jordan is there, and Syria is there as well, yes. They're agreeing to these notions in August of 67, yes. But they're also on the back end working with the Americans in hopes of working out a better deal. King Hussein has got to balance between the Palestinians in his own state and what is good ultimately for the state of Jordan, yes.
Was that conference before or after Black September?
That's before. This is well before. So we're going to get to that in a few minutes. All right, so that's the Khartoum Conference. No peace, no recognition, no negotiations. All right? For Israel, in the aftermath of this war, they of course gained the occupied territories, and you need to know those. That should be like encyclopedic for you. The Sinai Peninsula, Gaza Strip, West Bank, and Golan. Should know those 4 occupied territories. So they gain control of the occupied territories. They will have a closer relationship with the United States going forward. And we have now a political divide in Israel. Now that Israel controls the entirety of what was once the British Mandate of Palestine, the question now is what to do with it. And we begin to see a divide grow in Israeli politics. The left wing of the Israeli government, which is really controlling the government at this point, the left wing sees Sinai, Gaza, West Bank, Golan as being bargaining chips, as being things that can be used to get Israel security. Like, hey, Egypt, maybe we'll trade the Sinai Peninsula to you in turn for your recognition of us and ending a war with us. So the left wing of the Israeli government sees these occupied territories not as necessarily permanent occupations, or at least not entirely permanent occupations, but as bargaining chips. Whereas the right wing of Israeli politics, those former revisionists, we mentioned those guys, like those people that when they heard the Balfour Declaration say that the British are going to work for a homeland for Jews in Palestine, that's what the British said. The revisionists heard a homeland for Jews of Palestine, like that it should all be theirs. So some in the Israeli government feel that all of these territories should actually be a part of the Israeli state. So we begin to see this divide in Israel. Almost immediately, there will be the beginning of the construction of settlements in the occupied territories. Not only in the West Bank, but also in Gaza and in the Sinai. Construction of settlements. These are essentially subdivisions. Fenced-in, barbed-wired subdivisions where Jewish settlers will move into to begin to populate these territories. The Americans. The Americans are becoming more supportive, especially publicly, like in the American public is becoming more supportive of the Israeli cause here. But behind the scenes, the American government is a little less supportive of Israel. Now, where does the support from the American public come from? Well, you've got a lot of things going on here. This is 1967, right? We're 20 years away from World War II. So Americans, if you're an adult American, you remember the Second World War, right? And what do you remember about the Second World War with respect to Israel and Jews? You remember the Holocaust. So there is a deep sympathy for the Jewish plight around the world. You also have like a recognition when you look at like Israeli Jews in Israel compared to maybe Arabs in the area. The Israelis, most of them are like that have gone to Palestine. Most of them are of European descent, just like most Americans, right? So they've got maybe a more common background that they've come from. And there's also this kind of notion of a settler movement in America, like, hey, The American story is about going to a place and making a country out of what we perceived as nothingness, although Native Americans would disagree, right? Well, the Israeli narrative is very similar. Going to a place that really was underdeveloped and turning it into something. And that had a lot appeal for a lot of Americans. So the American public was generally supportive of the Israeli cause. The American government, not so much so. Remember, what's the American government going through in 1967-68? Okay, going through a Cold War, going through Vietnam. We don't want to see more war and conflict around the world, all right? We want to see this part of the world, be chilled out. Because chaos in this part of the world is going to mean the Soviet Union is going to get more involved. And lo and behold, what happened? Israel attacked Egypt. Egypt got defeated, and Egypt did what? Pushed closer to the Soviets. We don't want that. So the United States is absolutely supportive of some kind of resolution to this issue. Not so far that it would lead to the end of the nation of Israel, but we want Israel to ultimately give these territories back. We don't think Israel has a legitimate claim to these occupied territories. We want Israel to use them as bargaining chips for negotiations, even though the Arab states say they won't negotiate. We do, however, start arming Israel. But I want you to be careful about what military preparedness and what weapons can do and what they maybe even do when they're not being used, right? I think I've told this to you guys before. I work out a lot. Lift a lot of weights, study a lot of martial arts. I'm pretty tough. All right? I know. That's why kids don't mess with me. They don't mess with me, not because I'm cool or funny or anything else. They don't mess with me because they know I could destroy them. Right? You learn martial arts. You learn martial arts not so you use them. You use it as a deterrent. My body is like a hydrogen bomb, right? And no one threatens me, no one's going to challenge me because they know I could go off at any second. So they relax, they stay back. Yes, Kevin? Don't push me, Kevin.
Remember when Tommy tried to burst that 100 bomb?
We started having a countdown, yes. But anyway, so the point of America, so please be careful, because you're going to hear me say right now that the United States is going to start selling weapons to Israel and giving Israel military aid. And that might, on the face of it, make you think the United States is like totally behind the nation of Israel and we want Israel to be strong. Well, yes. But do we want Israel to be strong so they can attack their neighbors? No. We want Israel to be strong so they don't get attacked by their neighbors. If we build up Israeli military, if we help them grow in strength and stature, we have less fear that the Arab states would actually attack them. And what do we want in the Middle East? Peace. No war. So we are hoping that our military aid will actually be a deterrent to future war, much like my many martial arts skills. All right? It's ridiculous. The one fight I was ever in my life, it was because my neighbor, you guys probably all had kids like this around your house, like they just happened to live next door to you, but they weren't particularly nice, but just they were the only kids around that you got to play with. So I had one of these kids growing up, and he was all right until like a third kid came around, and then it was like they're going to start messing with me. So on this one day, they were messing with me, and I just wanted to go home, and they hid my shoes, and then, of course, I started crying, and I just couldn't find my shoes, and I wanted to go home, and I was upset, and I punched this kid, and then I ran home crying. And that was the only fight I was ever in, all right? It's a long time. I was like 24 when that happened. It was I was probably like 8. I don't know what it was. So despite what you guys may think, I am not a master of any martial arts, nor do I fight. Anyway, so the United States is going to be arming Israel, but not because we want them to fight, but because we don't want another fight. We want the Arab nations to say, we don't want to mess with that, because we want to keep things relatively calm. Yes? Why is it so important to be recognized by other nations? Well, in this case, you've got, like, look to today. ISIS has proclaimed themselves the Islamic State, but they're not recognized by other nations, right? And because of that, you've got the other nations where they want to, like, build a state saying, no, we don't accept you, like in Syria and in Iraq. Like, for a state to come into existence, all the land around the world is pretty much gobbled up, right? For a state to come into existence, it's got to take land from something else that was once a state, right? And so you've got to have people accepting that as legitimate. If they don't, you'll have an instance of constant warfare. You guys remember after World War I, we talked about the Locarno treaties, where the western borders of Europe were, like, agreed to ultimately. We won't beef about those borders anymore. Okay, cool. If you're not going to beef about borders, everybody's cool. Everybody accepts what's going on. Or the basic treaty between East and West Germany, where East and West Germany say, all right, we're cool with each other. We recognize that the other country is actually there and they're a legit country and we'll deal with them. You've got to have nations recognizing other nations so they can talk to each other and so they don't have constant strife between them. In this case, if Israel is not recognized, you have a constant state of tension from all of the nations surrounding them that they know that they want Israel gone. And if Israel were to be recognized, so why don't they just recognize? If Israel were to be recognized, then the plight of the Palestinians and the refugee crisis would cease to be cared about by other states. So it matters to be recognized, right? Cool. Kevin, did you have your hand up briefly? Okay. Man, I'm good. All right. So anyway, that's where the United States is coming from. Soviet Union. Soviet Union was supportive of Egypt and Israel in this war. And in the aftermath of the war, the war happened so fast. There's not like there's new shipments going into Egypt and Syria as the war is going on. But Egypt and Syria had arms from the Soviet Union, all right, before the war. The Soviet Union will begin rebuilding the Egyptian military in the aftermath of the war. But, and this is an important note, helps out the story, the weapons and the arms that the Soviets sell to the Egyptians are not as high quality as the arms that the Americans are sending to the Israelis. Now, this is not to say that this is because the Soviets were just behind the Americans. That's not the case. But while America was selling jets like the F-4 fighter, our top-of-the-line fighter jet at the time, the Soviets were selling the Egyptians older model jets. Here's what the Soviets want. The Soviets want Egypt to be rebuilt. The Soviets want Egypt to lean on the Soviet Union. The Soviets want Egypt to offer up the Soviets access to the Mediterranean Sea, which they will get. Hi. The Soviets want access to the Mediterranean Sea, which they will get. But what do the Soviets not want? They don't want an Egypt feeling too confident. They don't want an Egypt that will actually feel so strong that it could legitimately attack Israel and win a fight. Because if Egypt attacks Israel, that means war. And war is no good for anybody. What are the Americans and the Soviets trying to start to work on by the time we get to 68, 69, 70? This is a détente era. We want to ease tensions, not create new ones. And the next war in the Middle East could be a war that brings the Soviets and the Americans together in that war, against each other in that war. So they're very cautious about that. All right, one other group we need to talk about before we get to the Palestinians is the United Nations. The United Nations will issue a statement in the aftermath of this war, and it is called UNSC, United Nations Security Council. UNSC. Resolution, yes ma'am? This is 1967. This is after the war. UNSC 242, United Nations Security Council Resolution 242. If you guys get an essay, paper 1, about the Six-Day War, the aftermath of it, you might be reading United Nations Security Council 242 in there. This is a resolution. A resolution, for those of you that know legislative debate, you know about this stuff. A resolution is an opinion of the body. This is what the United Nations Security Council thinks. But resolutions, like anything else, can be vetoed. This one's obviously not going to be vetoed by anybody. So we've got now agreement between who on the Security Council? U.S., Taiwan. At this point, we don't have China back on the Security Council yet. Soviets, France, and Britain. Very good. Security Council is going to call, in Resolution 242, for the withdrawal of Israel from the occupied territories. The UN Security Council wants Israel to withdraw. They want all claims of war to come to an end, along with a respect for the sovereignty of all these nations. That word, sovereign, to be sovereign means your borders are respected and you are recognized. So they think Egypt and Israel and Syria and Jordan and all these countries need to respect the sovereignty of each other. The United Nations calls for a just settlement of the refugee problem. And finally, a call for the political independence of all states. Now, this is just a resolution. This is just the opinion. There's nothing like actionable in this. For example, there's nothing in the resolution that says, if Israel doesn't withdraw, then we will send in some kind of peacekeeping force, or we will force Israel out. There's nothing in there that does that. What would have happened? What would the United States have done if that would have been forced? We would have probably vetoed it. We wouldn't have agreed to it. All this is a resolution, and you probably can notice some problems in this resolution. For example, the just settlement of the refugee problem. What's the problem with that statement? Yeah, what does that mean? What is just? What would the Arabs think a just settlement to the refugee problem is? Very good, and we're going to use that phrase, right to return, or the right of return. They get to go back to their original homes. The Jews wouldn't accept that, right? So, what would be a just settlement would be in dispute. Also notice that even though this resolution starts with telling Israel it needs to leave the occupied territories, the resolution finds fault in both sides. Israel got to leave the occupied territories. But the Arab nations need to recognize the sovereignty of the nation of Israel. So this is the United Nations statement on this war. But none of it is actionable, and it ultimately doesn't drive any change. But it will be used as ammunition, especially by the Arab side, to say the the nation of Israel is in violation of the United Nations. As long as Israel holds on to these territories, Arab states and the Palestinians can say the Israelis are violating the United Nations Security Council Resolution 242. But because anything you can do, I can do better, the Israelis can say, well, you guys are in violation of UN 242 as well, because you're not recognizing us. All right? So that's what the United Nations has to say. Does it do anything? No. So if you guys get a question about how effective the United Nations is, maybe you use this as a little bit of an example, as they make a statement, but there's nothing actionable there. All right. This UN statement was accepted by the Israelis and the Jordanians and the Egyptians, but it was ultimately rejected by the Palestinians and Syrians. Now, when I say accepted, rejected, they have no say on the Security Council, but they can state their opinions of what we think of it. And the Palestinians aren't going to accept anything that accepts the existence of the State of Israel. But Egypt does, and Jordan does. And that's important, because despite the Arab nations issuing the 3 no's of Khartoum, no peace, no negotiation, no recognition, Egypt accepting the terms of the UN 242 kind of says what? Okay, we'll kind of recognize. Yes. And Israel. Yep. Now, but remember, to accept it means nothing. There's nothing to accept. They accept it in principle. Like, hey, if you guys do that, we could do this. but nothing is actually going to come of it. But now we come to the next issue, and we'll talk more about these people in a moment. If you're a Palestinian, what are you now thinking about Egypt and Jordan? Wait a minute, they're not really on our team anymore. Maybe they were only out for their own good all along. And the Palestinians are going to have to start standing on their own. And we'll talk about that more in a few minutes, okay? Now, in real terms, what's going on in the aftermath of the Six-Day War? We have a new war to discuss, and it is known in the Arab-Israeli conflict as the War of Attrition. Can I give you a quick heads up for the IB Paper 2 Topic 1 Wars question? Some things that we've talked about in the Arab-Israeli conflict are absolutely wars. All right? 1948, war. Six-Day War, war. The October 73 war that we're going to talk about after break, war. The Suez Crisis, not a war, crisis. Cuban Missile Crisis, not a war, crisis. Don't confuse crises with wars. All right? The Cold War, not a war. That's the confusing one. So when you write about wars in the 20th century, don't write about the Cold War. You can write about Korea, Vietnam, Six-Day War, 73 War, not the Cold War. And don't consider a crisis a war. All right? The War of Attrition is kind of a weird one because it's not much of a war. In fact, I would argue that in many respects, like what happened at the Suez Crisis was almost as much of a war. The War of Attrition is the aftermath of the Six-Day War, where you've got Egypt and Israel on either side of the Suez Canal, occasionally firing shots at each other across that canal. Israel will develop fortifications, and Egypt will do the same. It almost looks like it could be plucked out of like the Gallipoli campaign in the First World War. We've got some trench lines. This is the Israeli Bar-Lev line. You don't need to worry about that. But it's their line of defenses on their side now of the Sinai-Suez Canal. Now with the Americans arming the Israelis and the Egyptians being armed by the Soviets, these two countries will use these new weapons against each other. In January of 1970, Israel will use some of their new F-4 fighters to do long-range bombing runs as deep as Cairo. They'll start bombing into Cairo. This gives great concern to the Americans and the Soviets, who don't want to see a bigger war develop in the area. The American Secretary of State, a guy named William Rogers. I know what you're thinking. Wait a minute, Mr. Dobie, I thought Nixon's Secretary of State was Kissinger. Not yet. Kissinger will become Nixon's Secretary of State, but initially he's Nixon's national security advisor. Anyway, in 1970, we've got this guy William Rogers as Secretary of State. He puts forth a plan to try to ease the tensions between the Israelis and the Egyptians. It's known as the Rogers Plan. Essentially, the Rogers Plan repeats a lot of what the United Nations Security Council Resolution 242 had already said. That Israel should back out of the territories, that there should be peace between the new nations, there should be a fair settlement to the refugee problem. Again, what's the problem? We don't really recognize what fair means. But in the end, Egypt and Israel ultimately sign a ceasefire based on the Rogers Plan. They stop the fighting. So now if you're the Palestinians, you are deeply concerned that the nation that was once most supportive of you, Egypt, is now seemingly making deals with the Israelis. So now we're going to talk about what the Palestinians are up to. They feel that they are now standing on their own. Egypt is now making ceasefire agreements with Israel in the Rogers Plan. Jordan is now trying to deal with the Americans to work out a deal with the Israelis. And the Palestinians, who are mostly operating out of the nation of Jordan, are feeling like they're being left alone. So the Palestinians will begin to move to organize themselves against the state of Israel. This guy is Yasser Arafat. We've already mentioned him. He was a founder of the Fatah movement back in the 1950s to organize Palestinian guerrillas. Then we mentioned in 1964, Egypt organizes the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, to unite Palestinians under Egyptian control. By 1967, Fatah is going to be absorbed into the PLO. And by 1969, Yasser Arafat will be the leader of that organization, the PLO. The PLO is calling for an armed struggle against the nation of Israel, especially in light of the fact that the nations, the Arab nations, can't seem or don't seem to want to do it themselves. So the PLO is calling for an armed struggle as the only way to liberate Palestine. They absolutely oppose the Rogers Plan, because that would call for some recognition of Israel. And they feel that the Palestinian cause is being betrayed by Egypt and by Jordan. And so in an odd twist to the story, the Palestinians, who have long had as their primary enemy in this story the state of Israel, now begin to look more at the nation of Jordan as an enemy. Because the Palestinians don't have a state. They don't have an army. They don't have anything to give, right? Remember, what is getting Egypt all those fancy Russian weapons? The Soviet Union. And why is the Soviet Union dealing with Egypt? Because they've got a big Mediterranean coast. And they can help the Soviets out with naval bases on the Mediterranean Sea. What do the Palestinians have to give anybody? Nothing. Right? A lot of times these deals are made like a you pat my back, I'll pat your back kind of thing. Right? The Palestinians have nothing to give. They need a state. They need a state that will be friendly to them. And right now, King Hussein of Jordan is not that guy. So the Palestinians, under Yasser Arafat's leadership, see as the best way to ultimately defeat Israel is to get rid of the king of Jordan, King Hussein of Jordan. In September of 1970 alone, there will be 2 assassination attempts against the king of Jordan, both failing. But this has got to be front of the mind of King Hussein of Jordan, because what happened to his grandfather? Killed by Palestinian assassins, right, back in 1950. Also, around the same time, we have the hijacking of 4 airplanes where Palestinian terrorists call for the release of Palestinian Fedayeen guerrillas that were in Jordanian jails. Now, why are Fedayeen in Jordanian jails? Because Jordan doesn't need these people hopping across the border into Israel, bringing Israel in to attack them. So, planes are hijacked. Now, this is something that's like kind of, like, remember the other day in the news we heard about this hijacking and it kind of freaked us all out, right? We're like, oh my gosh, here we go again. There's another like terrorist attack going on. And it turned out to be, instead of some guy connected to ISIS, it was some guy who had a couple screws loose and he like was trying to get his girl to love him again or something like this. And ultimately everybody was let off the plane safely and the guy was arrested and everything came to a happy end. But hijacking is kind of like rare today. In the 70s, what's that? No, I know. Well, that's why it was so shocking, because it's rare. We don't hear about it all the time. In the late 60s and into the 70s, it was a much more common occurrence. Yes, sir?
Where did they land the planes in? Korea?
No, they went to, I want to say they went to Uganda, northern Uganda, I believe. I think it was in Uganda they took them to. Yeah. So anyway, let's get back to this. In the 60s and 70s, there were a lot of hijackings happening. It's not like it was ever present, like another plane being hijacked, but it was more common. Like we're talking about 90 to 100 a year in the late 60s, early 70s, around the world, all right? they happened for different reasons. Sometimes planes were hijacked because people were trying to escape communist nations in Eastern Europe or the Soviet Union, and they were using that as an attempt to get to freedom. But by the late 60s and into the early 70s, the Palestinian movement, Palestinian Liberation Organization, started supporting actions like these. Because this is the kind of thing that could get the rest of the world who doesn't care about Israel or Palestine, maybe has never even heard of the Palestinian cause, to look and see, wait a minute, wow, they must be really angry. What are they so concerned about? Let me look into this story. And they thought if people looked into the story, they would have more sympathy for the Palestinian cause. So 4 planes were hijacked. Now, ultimately, all of the passengers and the captains of these planes and the crew were let off. And then the planes were blown up. All right? It was symbolic, though. Like, hey, maybe next time we won't let people off. So we better start dealing with this issue, right? World. Now, why are the Palestinians resorting to something like this? They have no army. They have to use these kinds of guerrilla tactics, right? That are seemingly unconventional and wrong, but that's all they've got. King Hussein can't stand for this kind of stuff anymore. And so in September of 1971, King Hussein will call for the Jordanian army to attack PLO positions in Jordan. So King Hussein turns his army against Palestinians inside Jordan. And I'm going to repeat this so we can keep everything straight. Jordanian King Hussein uses his army to target Palestinian positions in Jordan. As Palestinians are being targeted in Jordan, Syria, to the north of Jordan, invades Jordan. And this is where, I think we begin to see how crazy and messed up this political system or situation in the Middle East is, and it's to this day. Whereas Israel was originally the prime enemy, now you have an Arab nation of Syria invading an Arab nation of Jordan. Why? Well, the Syrians didn't like the king of Jordan, and they had already, ousted their former colonial rulers, and the King Hussein of Jordan is still connected with the British and the Americans, and they want him out of power. Well, the Americans and the Soviets, neither of them want to see a bigger war break out in the Middle East. So the Americans, who are getting all détente with the Soviet Union at this point, says, hey, Soviets, why don't you talk to Syria, your friends in Syria, who you are arming, and tell them to stop this invasion of Jordan? The Soviet Union's like, yeah, we need to stop this. Get Syria on the line and say, stop this invasion of Jordan! Stop it! And the Syrians do. They withdraw from Jordan. Here is an instance, during détente, that the Americans and the Soviets actually were able to, get something done. But this is ultimately no good for those Palestinians in Jordan. And what began in September becomes known by Palestinians as Black September, where by the end of it, 3,000 Palestinians will be killed at the hands of the Jordanian army. 11,000 more wounded. The PLO is forced to flee Jordan. They will ultimately take up shop in Lebanon, just to the north of Israel. This is a time in the Palestinians' minds known as Black September, because it happened in September, and it was a dark time for Palestinians. In the meantime, while all this is going down, the president of Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser, dies. He has a heart attack. It's kind of incredible, right? If you were trying to script this story, you probably couldn't make it any, I don't want to say better, but more interesting or more devastating than what happened in real life. Nasser dies while all this is going down. And he will be replaced by his successor, a guy known as Anwar Sadat, S-A-D-A-T. We will talk much more about him later. Anwar Sadat. In the aftermath of this, the PLO does not quit. The PLO does not quit. They're just operating from a new base. And now they have two prime enemies, nation of Israel and the nation of Jordan. In November of 1971, Jordanian Prime Minister is going to be in Cairo, Egypt, where he will be assassinated by Palestinian terrorists. The Jordanian Prime Minister in Egypt, assassinated by Palestinians. And in 1972, an event which now becomes what shapes in most Westerners' minds what modern terrorism is. In September of 1972, at the Munich, Germany Olympic Games. September of 72, Munich, Germany. It's a big city in southern Germany. Summer Olympics are being held, right? Summer Olympics, a big time for everybody to get together and have international camaraderie, right? And some competition. It's held in Germany. First Olympic Games to be held in Germany since the 1936 Olympic Games, when Hitler was showing off his master race to the world. Unfortunately, Jesse Owens also showed up to the same Olympics and didn't work out well for Hitler and his people. Anyway, 1972 Olympic Games. The Israeli Olympic team is going to be there. And the Palestinians know this. A Palestinian terrorist group known as the Black September. So now we have two Black Septembers, right? The calendar Black September, what Palestinians consider the literal month of September, when the Jordanians waged war against them in Jordan. That's Black September. And now a terrorist group of Palestinians taking that same name. Terrorist group known as Black September, 8 members of this organization raid the Olympic Village, where all the athletes are staying during the Olympic Games. They raid the Olympic Village. They storm the Israelis' rooms in the Olympic Village, immediately killing 2 Israeli trainers and taking 9 other hostages. They demand the release of prisoners in exchange, release of Palestinian prisoners in exchange for the release of these Olympic athletes. Israel, carrying a policy that lives on to this day by Israel and America alike, refuses to negotiate with these demands. The idea there being, if you negotiate with terrorists, because remember, you can negotiate with states because states have things to give, right? There can be a give and take there. In negotiating with terrorists, the feeling is it will only encourage more terrorist activities. If taking a few hostages results in 10 prisoners being freed, well, maybe that just encourages the taking of more hostages. This is why it was so controversial when Barack Obama, if you followed the news of the last couple of years, there was an American soldier, a guy named Bo Bergdahl, did you hear his story, who went AWOL. This is anybody listening to the Serial podcast right now? No? Oh, man, you guys are so out of tune. There's a Serial podcast. It's really good. A lot of people, it's the #1 podcast. The 2nd season of Serial right now is all about the Bo Bergdahl case. And it's interesting. You hear from his mouth what he did and what he experienced. You hear the case against him. Bo Bergdahl is an American soldier in Afghanistan who went AWOL. He left his unit. And he was taken by Taliban in Afghanistan. And he was a prisoner of theirs for 5 years it was, yeah. He was eventually freed in an exchange, in a prisoner exchange. And many chastised Barack Obama for allowing this exchange to go down. But anyway, the Israelis aren't going to negotiate with the terrorists. And so the German police concoct a plan where they will ultimately give the terrorists part of what they want, an escape from the Olympic Village and helicopters, which were meant to take them to the airport. But when all this went down, it ended up being a German ambush. The German police opened fire upon the terrorists with sharpshooters, hoping to take them out of commission and free the prisoners. Ultimately, that didn't happen. And in the end, 5 of the 8 Black September terrorists were killed. All of the hostages were killed. All of the hostages were killed. And it became the darkest moment of the history, in the history of the modern Olympic Games. After this attack, it's just a little side note to it, after this attack, the 3 Palestinians that were arrested by the Germans would ultimately be freed within just a couple months of the attacks. They will be freed in exchange for another plane that was hijacked, to free the hostages on another hijacked plane, a German plane. And so there would be an exchange. The Germans negotiated, right? The Germans gave up these 3 Palestinian prisoners in exchange for the passengers and the crew of this Lufthansa plane. In the aftermath, Israel took it into their own hands to seek retribution for these actions. And the Israeli, a group called the Mossad, M-O-S-S-A-D, which is like the Israeli CIA, hunted down anybody connected with these attacks at the Olympic Games. 2 of the 3 were found and were murdered by the Mossad. Like, we're talking like bombings and killing. Poison in one case. A third is supposedly living in Africa right now, still alive, but unknown location, because Israel would love to know where that person is. So that is the end of the story.